My name is Doctor Alan Finch. I am 74 years old. The man who holds that name, that title, he officially retired from the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, in 1998. The official record states that my retirement was due to health reasons, a weak heart. That's a lie. My heart is as strong as an ox. It's my soul that's weak. It's my memory that's diseased. I live in a small, meticulously clean apartment in a city I will not name. The windows are covered with blackout curtains, but not for the reason you might think. It's not the light I'm afraid of. It's the concrete, the brick, the asphalt. Sometimes if I look at a skyscraper for too long, I feel a pang of something in the pit of my stomach. A deep, gnawing, and profoundly unnatural craving. And I have to close my eyes and breathe until it passes. I'm speaking into a UHER 4000 Report L, a beautiful piece of German engineering from the 1960s. It's a dinosaur, a fossil, but it is pure analog. There's no digital signature, no way for this recording to be traced through a network, and it must not be traced. Because the people I used to work for, the quiet, efficient men from the Pentagon's Special Projects Division who oversaw our work, they do not like loose ends. And I am the last loose end from Project Lithivore. For 38 years, I have honored the oath of silence I was forced to take. I buried the truth under a mountain of classified reports and redacted files. I took the commendations for my discretion. I accepted the comfortable pension. I did it because I was afraid, and because a part of me, the scientist part, was convinced that the secret I carried was too dangerous for public knowledge. I believed that some things were better left buried. But 2 days ago, I read an article in a geological trade journal. It was a small piece, buried on page 42. A new joint venture between a tech billionaire and a mining corporation has been granted permission to begin exploratory drilling in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. They are testing a new form of deep earth sonic fracturing, using resonance to search for rare earth mineral deposits. And the map accompanying the article, showing the proposed survey area, made my blood run cold. It was centered directly over a long abandoned coal mine, a place called Blackwood Shaft No. 4. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like a winter chill, that they were going to ring a dinner bell that has been silent for nearly 4 decades. They are going to wake the hunger. So this is my final, unauthorized report. My confession. My warning. The truth must be told. The truth about what happened to the 12 miners from the Blackwood Shaft. The truth about the USAMRIID Rapid Response Team Delta. And the truth about the woman who saved my life, and perhaps the world, by sacrificing her own. Her name was Dr. Eris Thorne, and she was the finest biologist I have ever known. She deserved a monument. Instead, she got a footnote in a falsified accident report. This is her story. This is the story of the hunger that sleeps under the hills. It all began in the autumn of 1985. The world was a different place then. The Cold War was in its final icy decade, and we at USAMRIID were the front line against a different kind of enemy. Weaponized pathogens, biological warfare. We thought we were prepared for anything. We were arrogant. We were fools. We had no category, no protocol, for a life form that wasn't interested in killing its host, but in changing what it means to be alive. I was 36 years old, and I still believed that science had an answer for everything. That was my first and most profound mistake. The call came in on a Tuesday. I remember the day with photographic clarity because I was in the middle of running a diagnostic on a new gas chromatograph in my lab at Fort Detrick. The air smelled of ozone and sterile alcohol. The phone rang, a shrill, insistent sound that cut through the low hum of the lab equipment. It was General Miller, our commanding officer. His voice on the phone was devoid of its usual bluster, replaced by a tight, clipped urgency. "Finch," he said without preamble, "spin up your team. You have a Priority 1 deployment, a possible contagion event in a civilian population." My mind immediately began cycling through the nightmare scenarios. A hemorrhagic fever, like Ebola or Marburg, jumping from some animal reservoir. An airborne fungal infection. Anthrax. "Sir," I said, already grabbing a notepad, "what are we looking at? What are the symptoms?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Miller spoke again, his voice was laced with a confusion that was far more alarming than any panic would have been. "That's the thing, Alan. The report from the CDC field agent is anomalous. The initial presentation is extreme malnutrition, emaciation, but the subjects aren't hungry." I stopped writing. "Sir, I don't understand. Malnutrition is a state, not a symptom. Are they wasting? Is it a prion disease like Kuru?" "Negative," Miller said. "No neurological degradation reported. The subjects are, according to the report, they were found in a state of lethargy, but conscious. And here's the part that got my attention. 12 coal miners, a full shift, went missing for 3 days in a mine in West Virginia. When the rescue team found them, they were all alive, but they had lost, on average, 20% of their body mass. They looked like skeletons, but their lunch pails, their canteens, they were all full. They hadn't touched a bite of food or a drop of water. The company doctor who did the initial examination thought it was some kind of mass hysteria, some kind of hunger strike. But he had them x-rayed." General Miller paused again. I could hear the faint rustle of a paper being turned over on his desk. "Their stomachs and intestinal tracts were full, Alan. Packed solid." A wave of relief washed over me. "Pica," I said, the answer feeling obvious. "Textbook. It's a known psychological compulsion, an appetite for non-nutritive substances. Clay, soil, paint chips. The stress of being trapped underground must have triggered a mass, psychotic event." "They didn't eat clay, Alan," Miller said, and his voice was flat and cold as a morgue slab. "The X-rays and the subsequent endoscopic biopsies confirmed the presence of ingested material. Their stomachs were full of anthracite coal, shale, and limestone. They had been eating the goddamn mine." The notepad slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. The sterile, orderly world of my laboratory seemed to recede, replaced by a sudden, vivid image of a man in the dark, his face caked with black dust, desperately clawing at a rock wall and stuffing chunks of it into his mouth. I am a scientist. I am trained to be objective, to reduce horror to data. But this was a biological impossibility. The human digestive system cannot process rock. The men should have been dead from internal bleeding and perforations. "The local authorities have the area quarantined," Miller continued, his voice pulling me back from the image. "The miners are being held in an isolation wing at a local hospital. They're too weak to move. The mine itself, Blackwood Shaft number 4, has been sealed. This is being handled off the books, Alan. The official story is a carbon monoxide leak. We need you to go in, assess the site, retrieve samples, and identify the vector. Dr. Thorne is already prepping her gear. A transport helicopter will be ready for you and your team in 90 minutes. Find out what the hell is going on down there." The line went dead. I stood there in the silence of my lab, the hum of the machine suddenly sounding like a low, predatory growl. Pica wasn't a disease. It was a symptom. A symptom of what? What kind of pathogen, what kind of toxin, what kind of environmental agent could rewrite one of the most fundamental, hardwired instincts of any living creature, the drive to eat, and replace it with a craving for stone? It was a violation of the very principles of biology. Life eats life. It doesn't eat the world itself. I called Eris Thorne on the internal line. She picked up on the first ring. Eris was our lead virologist and field biologist, a woman whose mind moved at a speed that always left me slightly breathless. She was brilliant, intuitive, and had a habit of seeing patterns where the rest of us just saw chaos. "Did you get the call?" she asked, her voice calm and focused. "I did," I said, still trying to wrap my mind around the impossible data. "What do you make of it? A neurotoxin from a pocket of natural gas? Some kind of undiscovered fungus with psychotropic properties?" I was grasping at straws, trying to fit this monstrously square peg into the round hole of my scientific understanding. "I don't know, Alan," she said, and there was a note in her voice I had never heard before. It wasn't fear. It was a kind of intellectual awe. But it feels ancient. It feels like something that has been sleeping for a very, very long time. It's not a disease as we understand it. It's a repurposing, a biological hijacking. Something taught those men a new kind of hunger. Her words hung in the air between us, pregnant with a terrible significance. A new kind of hunger. We were being sent to investigate a medical mystery, a contagion. But in my heart, I felt a cold dread coalesce. We weren't just going to fight a disease. We were going to meet the thing that taught it. We were going to the schoolhouse. The journey to Blackwood Shaft number 4 was a descent, both literally and metaphorically. The first stage was a C-130 Hercules transport plane from Maryland to a small, decommissioned air base in West Virginia. The inside of the plane was cavernous and cold, the roar of the 4 turboprop engines a constant bone-jarring drone. Our team was small, elite. There was myself and Eris Thorne, representing the science. We were accompanied by a 2-man security and logistics detail from the Army's Chemical Corps, Sergeant Brolin and Specialist Miller. Brolin was a thick-necked, taciturn man who looked like he had been chiseled from the same granite as a war memorial. Miller was his opposite, young, barely 22, with a nervous energy and a habit of checking his gear obsessively. And then there was the 5th member of our initial team, a man who introduced himself only as Graves. He wasn't military. He wasn't a scientist. He was from Interagency Liaison, which was a polite euphemism for the CIA or some other 3-letter spook shop. He was our political minder, our babysitter, sent to ensure the official story held and that the science did not contradict the narrative. He was a man in a gray suit, with gray eyes and a face that seemed designed to be forgettable, and he spent the entire flight taking meticulous notes in a small black notebook. He was the first sign that this was more than just a public health crisis. This was a matter of national security. From the airbase, we were transferred to a Black Hawk helicopter for the final leg of the journey into the Appalachian Mountains. As the helicopter lifted off, the world of neat, orderly grids and paved roads fell away. Below us, the earth became a rumpled green blanket of trees, stretching to every horizon. The mountains rolled on and on, ancient, silent, and folded in on themselves, hiding their secrets in deep, dark valleys and hollows. It was a landscape that felt profoundly old, a place that had existed long before man and would exist long after we were gone. The pilot was a local, a reservist called up for the task. He was a lean, weather-beaten man with a cynical squint and a wad of chewing tobacco tucked into his cheek. He flew the helicopter with a casual, almost lazy grace, his hands resting lightly on the controls. "You folks from the government?" he asked over the headset, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Hear about the mess up at the Blackwood pit?" Major Kincaid, our military liaison who had met us at the airbase, a stern, by-the-book officer, answered before I could. "That information is classified, son." The pilot just chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Ain't nothing classified in these hills for long, Major. Word gets around. Besides, I know what you are. Seen your kind before. USAMRIID. Fort Detrick. You only show up when something real bad crawls out of the ground." He banked the helicopter, following the curve of a deep, wooded ravine. "You want to know what the old-timers say about that place? About the Blackwood Seam?" "Local folklore is not relevant to our mission," Kincaid stated flatly. But Eris leaned forward. "I'd like to hear it," she said, her voice inviting. The pilot glanced back, his eyes lingering on Eris for a moment before turning back to the controls. "They call it rock fever," he said. "It ain't a real thing, you understand? Just a story they tell. Say that sometimes a man spends too long in the deep seams, down in the dark, where the coal is old and black as a sinner's heart, and he starts to change. He gets quiet, stops eating the food his wife packs him. They say he starts hearing things. A sound, like a singing or a humming, coming from the rock itself. And he gets a look in his eyes. A hungry look, but not for food. My scientific mind was already dismissing it. Stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Malnutrition causing cognitive changes. Every part of the folklore had a rational medical explanation. It was a classic ghost story. A way for a community to process the inherent dangers of their profession. "What kind of hungry?" Eris asked, her voice quiet. "The wrong kind," the pilot said, and a sliver of something that wasn't cynicism crept into his voice. "They say the man starts getting thin, wasting away. But he's strong, stronger than he ought to be. And people find little piles of pebbles and grit by his front door. Or they find him in the woods, just standing there, staring at a rock face like it's the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. They say the mountain, it calls to him, and it wants to be eaten." A chill that had nothing to do with the altitude snaked its way down my spine. The parallels to our case were too specific, too neat. Piles of pebbles. A wrong kind of hunger. It was one thing to read about it in a sanitized report. It was another to hear it spoken aloud in the local vernacular, a piece of living, breathing folklore. As if on cue, the radio in the cockpit, which had been playing a faint country music station, crackled with static. The music was abruptly cut off, replaced by a strange, rhythmic sound. It was a soft, percussive clicking. Click, tack, click. Click, tack, click. It was a clean, dry sound, like two stones being tapped together in a steady, unhurried rhythm. "What is that?" Specialist Miller asked, his nervous energy spiking. "Is that a number station?" The pilot frowned, tapping the radio console. "Never heard that before. Some kind of interference from the mountains, I reckon. Full of iron ore. Plays hell with radio signals." He switched the radio off. The clicking stopped, but the rhythm of it seemed to hang in the air in my mind. Click, tack, click. We flew on in silence for another 10 minutes. Then the pilot pointed ahead. "There she is. Your kingdom come." Through the cockpit window I saw it. The forest canopy broke, revealing a raw, red-brown scar on the mountainside. A clearing, bulldozed flat, with a few prefabricated buildings and the towering skeletal structure of a mine headframe. There were military vehicles parked in neat rows. Men in full mop gear, the military's version of a hazmat suit, were patrolling the perimeter fence. There was no sign of civilian life, no local police, no company men. The scene had been sterilized, but it was the mine entrance itself that drew my eye. It was a perfect black square cut into the base of the mountain. A wound. It gaped at us, dark, silent, and profoundly still. It didn't look like an accident scene. It looked like a place that was holding its breath, waiting for us. As the helicopter began its descent, I felt a low, irrational thrum of anxiety in my chest. It felt like we were landing on the shores of a place from which no one had ever returned. The maw of the mine seemed to inhale as we approached, a silent, dark invitation into the bones of the earth. Landing at the Blackwood site was like stepping into a bubble of surreal, clinical order imposed upon a landscape of raw, Appalachian wilderness. The moment the Black Hawk's skids touched the flattened, dusty earth of the clearing, the world outside the helicopter's cabin became a muffled ballet of practiced procedure. A ground crew, anonymous figures inside their bulky green Mop 4 suits, guided us out. The air, even through the filters of my own hastily donned respirator, was thick with the smells of the mountains, damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. But underneath it all, there was another smell. A faint, metallic, and vaguely sweet odor that I couldn't place. It was the smell of the mountain's blood. Our base of operations was a standard military deployable rapid assembly shelter, or DRASH tent, a large, inflatable structure that had been set up as a mobile command center and preliminary lab. Inside, the air hummed with the growl of a diesel generator and the whir of air filtration units. It was an island of sterile, artificial light and humming technology in the middle of the deep, silent woods. Major Kincaid immediately took charge, his voice a sharp counterpoint to the quiet dread that had settled over me. "Finch, Thorne, get your lab set up. I want a full environmental workup. Air, soil, water samples. Brolin, Miller, establish a secure comms link with Fort Detrick. Graves." He turned to the man in the gray suit who had been standing silently by the tent entrance, observing everything. "You have the run of the place. Just stay out of my team's way." Graves gave a thin, barely perceptible nod and walked over to a corner, where he sat down and opened his black notebook. He was a silent, ominous sentinel, a reminder that our scientific mission was secondary to the mission of containment. Not just containment of a pathogen, but containment of the truth. Aris and I worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, laying out our field equipment, portable biosafety cabinets, microscopes, sample containers. We were a good team. I was the methodical one, the logistician, the one who saw the world in terms of data and protocols. Oris was the artist, the intuitive thinker. She saw the symphony where I only heard the notes. "That smell," she said, her voice low as she calibrated a spectrometer. "It's inorganic, high in ferrous and cupric compounds, like rust, but fresher." Before I could reply, a medic from the quarantine team entered the tent. "Sirs," he said, addressing Kincaid but looking at me and Aris. "The local coroner's office delivered the package, as requested." The package was one of the miners, the one who had died in the local hospital from what the initial report called catastrophic organ failure. They had brought his body here to our field lab for a full autopsy. This was it, the first real look at our enemy. They brought him in on a gurney, sealed in a black military-grade body bag. The air in the tent immediately felt colder, heavier. Brolin and Miller fell silent. Even Graves looked up from his notebook. Aris and I donned our full RAC suits, the positive pressure biohazard suits that made us look like astronauts. The hiss of my respirator filled my helmet, a loud, intimate sound. We unzipped the bag. The man inside was a ruin. He couldn't have been more than 50, but his face was a gaunt, skeletal mask, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, his eyes sunken into deep, dark sockets. His body was emaciated, every rib visible. He looked like a victim of famine, a prisoner from a concentration camp. But it was his hands that held my attention. His fingernails were broken, worn down to the quicks, the skin around them raw and black with coal dust. These were the hands of a man who had been clawing at stone. "Let's begin," Aris said, her voice calm and professional through the comms in my helmet. but I could see the intense focus in her eyes through her faceplate. I made the first incision, the Y incision, from the shoulders down to the sternum, and then to the pubic bone. Standard procedure. But the moment my scalpel cut through the skin, something was wrong. There was no blood. Or rather, the blood that was there was thick, dark, and syrupy, almost like crude oil. It didn't flow. It oozed. Hemorrhagic and coagulation abnormalities, I noted, my voice sounding tinny and distant in my own ears. Massive dehydration. But the real horror was waiting for us when we opened the abdominal cavity. The man's stomach was distended, swollen tight as a drum, and it was unnaturally hard to the touch. It felt like a bag full of rocks. Eris used a pair of forceps to gently palpate the organ. "It's completely impacted," she said. "Whatever's in there, it's not being digested. It's just sitting." With extreme care, I made an incision into the stomach wall. The stench that erupted was not the smell of digestion or decay. It was the smell I had noticed outside. That sharp, metallic, sweetish odor of the mountain itself. And inside, packed so tightly it was almost a solid mass, was a slurry of gray and black material. It was exactly as the report had said. Coal, shale, and fragments of limestone, slick with a thick, dark mucus. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. Something the X-rays couldn't have shown. Woven throughout the mass of rock and mucus were fine, thread-like filaments. They were a pale, sickly green color, and they seemed to be pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible light of their own. "My God," Eris whispered, leaning in closer. "It's a mycelial network. It's a fungus." She carefully took a sample with a pair of sterile tweezers, placing the small piece of rock and its attached filaments into a sealed petri dish. "It wasn't the man who was eating the rock, Alan," she said, her voice filled with a terrible dawning understanding. "The man was the vessel. The fungus was eating the rock. It was using his body as a mining tool, as a digestive system. He wasn't the host. He was the machinery." We stood there for a long moment, looking down at the ravaged body on the cold steel table. The entire paradigm of our investigation had just shifted. We weren't dealing with a pathogen that attacked a person. We were dealing with a predator that wore a person like a suit. My eyes drifted from the body to the miners' abandoned lunch pails, which the team had collected and lined up on a separate table. They were old-fashioned, domed, metal lunchboxes. I walked over to one, my heavy suit boots clomping on the tent floor. I opened it. Inside was a neatly wrapped sandwich, an apple, and a thermos. Untouched. Perfect. I looked from the wholesome, uneaten food to the man on the table with a stomach full of stone, and a single, terrifying question echoed in the humming silence of the tent. What could be so powerful that it could overwrite the simple, profound joy of eating a sandwich and replace it with a ravenous hunger for the dead, sterile rock of the earth? The answer, I knew with a chilling certainty, was waiting for us just beyond the tree line, inside the silent, breathing darkness of Blackwood Shaft Number 4. The first night at the Blackwood site was a long, sleepless vigil played out against a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The deep, primeval forest that surrounded our small, brightly lit clearing was not silent. It was alive with the rustle of unseen animals, the hoot of a distant owl, and the constant whisper-soft sigh of the wind through the pine needles. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with a purpose of its own. The autopsy had stripped away any sense of clinical detachment. The abstract horror of the initial report now had a face, a name, and a stomach full of rocks. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that was part professional focus, part raw, human dread. Aris was hunched over a microscope, her face illuminated by its small light, examining the sample she had taken from the dead miner. I was at a different station, trying to analyze the air samples we had collected from the mine entrance. The data was maddeningly inconclusive. There were no unusual airborne toxins, no anomalous gas concentrations, nothing that could explain what had happened to those men. "Anything?" I asked her, my voice feeling loud in the relative quiet. She looked up, her eyes weary but alight with a fierce intelligence. "The filaments are definitely biological, a form of mold or fungus, but unlike any terrestrial species I've ever seen. The cellular structure is crystalline, and the bioluminescence is not a chemical reaction in the traditional sense. It's more like a solid-state energy transfer, like a living fiber optic cable. It's incredibly efficient." She paused, running a hand through her already messy hair. "But there's something else. There are no reproductive structures, no spores, no hyphae. At least, not on this sample. It seems to be inert, dormant." "So it's not airborne," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. If the vector wasn't in the air, containment was 1,000 times easier. "I don't think so," she said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "Maybe it requires direct contact. Ingestion." The conversation was interrupted by Specialist Miller, the young comms tech. He was sitting at his radio console, headphones clamped over his ears. He pulled them off with a grimace. "Sir," he said, looking at Major Kincaid, "I keep getting that same interference on the shortwave band, the clicking." "Filter it out, Specialist," Kincaid grunted, not looking up from the map he was studying. "I'm trying, sir," Miller said, his voice strained. "But it's weird. It's not drifting. It's on a fixed frequency, and it's getting stronger. It's giving me a hell of a headache." He rubbed his temples. "And I've got this weird taste in my mouth, like I've been sucking on a wet penny." I exchanged a look with Eris. A metallic taste in the mouth could be a symptom of heavy metal poisoning, or a neurological reaction to a number of toxins. "Maybe you should get some fresh air, Miller," I suggested. He nodded gratefully and slipped out of the tent. I watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach, a headache, a strange taste. The symptoms were vague, easily dismissible. But in this context, nothing was dismissible. I couldn't sit still. The generator hum was getting on my nerves. I needed to move. I told Kincaid I was going to do a perimeter check. He just nodded. I stepped out of the blinding light of the tent into the deep, velvet dark of the Appalachian night. The air was cold and sharp. The moon was a thin silver crescent, offering little light. The security floodlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed at the edge of the forest. I walked the fence line, my boots crunching on the gravel. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on all sides. It felt watchful. I found myself staring at the mine entrance. It was a patch of absolute blackness, a void that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was just a hole in a mountain, I told myself. A geological feature. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was an eye. A dull, unblinking reptilian eye, staring out from the ancient rock. And as I watched, I saw it. Deep within the darkness, a light. It wasn't the beam of a flashlight or the flame of a lantern. It was a soft, gentle pulse of sickly green light. It bloomed for a second, illuminating nothing but itself, a ghostly, ethereal glow. Then it faded, plunging the entrance back into absolute blackness. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of my tired eyes? Then it pulsed again, brighter this time. A slow, steady, rhythmic beat. A heartbeat. Glow, fade, glow, fade. It was the light from Eris's sample, but magnified 1,000 times. It was alive. It was the luminous, beating heart of the mountain. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, mesmerized by the silent, hypnotic rhythm. I felt a strange pull, a current of curiosity so strong it was almost a physical force, urging me to walk closer, to step into the darkness, to see the source of the beautiful, terrible light. I had to consciously force myself to take a step back, to break the spell. I turned and walked briskly back to the command tent, my mind racing. I had to tell Aris. I had to tell Kincaid. This changed everything. The organism wasn't dormant. It was active. It was awake. And it was calling. When I got back to the tent, I found Aris and Kincaid standing over Specialist Miller. He was sitting on a cot, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Miller's not feeling well," Aris said, her expression grim. "His headache is worse. He's complaining of nausea." But it was what I saw on the ground beside his cot that made the blood freeze in my veins. There, on the canvas floor of the tent, was a small, neat pile of gravel, the kind you find on a service road. Next to it were two smooth gray river stones. They were arranged in a perfect, deliberate little pyramid. "Miller," I said, my voice low. "Where did these rocks come from?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and confused. A thin trickle of saliva ran from the corner of his mouth. I don't know," he stammered. I just woke up and they were there." I knelt down and looked at his hands. His fingernails, which had been clean an hour ago, were caked with dirt and grit. He had been outside. He had been collecting them. And he didn't even remember doing it. The hunger, the wrong kind of hunger, had taken root. It wasn't just in the mine anymore. We had brought it into our camp. It was inside the wire. It was inside our man. The discovery of Miller's subconscious rock collecting sent a shockwave of cold, hard reality through the command tent. The theoretical horror had become an immediate practical crisis. Major Kincaid, who until now had been a stern but peripheral figure, stepped firmly into his role as military commander. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "Quarantine him," he snapped, pointing at Miller. "Now. Full isolation protocol. Brolin, get him into one of the auxiliary shelters. No one goes in or out without my direct authorization. Thorne, Finch, I want a diagnosis. What is this? How is it spreading? And how do we stop it?" His words were like bullets, rapid-fire commands designed to impose order on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into chaos. Miller didn't resist as Sergeant Brolin, his face grim, led him away. He was too confused, too sick. He just kept shaking his head, muttering, "I don't understand. I don't feel hungry. I just like the way they feel, the way they taste." The last word was a barely audible whisper, a confession of a madness he didn't even comprehend. The taste, the metallic tang he'd complained about. It wasn't a symptom. It was the beginning of the craving. The organism was recalibrating his senses, teaching his brain to associate the taste of minerals with a feeling of satisfaction. "It has to be the clicking," Aris said, her voice a low, intense hum. We were standing over her microscope, but her gaze was distant, seeing patterns I couldn't. "The radio interference. Miller was the comms tech. He had the most direct, prolonged exposure to it." "It's a sound, Aris," I argued, though my own skepticism was crumbling. "A sound can't transmit a pathogen." "Why not?" she countered, turning to face me, her eyes burning with intensity. "We transmit information with sound waves all the time. Radio, television, language. What if this organism doesn't reproduce with spores, but with a signal? A complex, resonant frequency that literally rewrites the neural pathways in the brain? The clicking isn't interference, Alan. It's the vector. It's the genetic code of the organism, translated into sound. It's not a fungus that spreads. It's a song. The idea was so far outside the bounds of established biology that my mind struggled to find a foothold. A pathogenic song. A biological signal that infected the brain. It was the stuff of science fiction, not a USAMRIID field report. But it was the only theory that fit all the facts. The lack of airborne spores, the specific targeting of the miners, and now, Miller. The pulse of light I saw in the mine, I said, the pieces clicking into place with a terrifying logic. It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, like a broadcast. Exactly, Eris said. Light and sound. It's communicating, or calling. And whatever it is, its heart is down there, in that shaft. We have to go in. We have to see it for ourselves. We need a primary sample from the source. Kincaid, who had been listening to our exchange, made his decision. All right, Thorne, Finch, you two go. Brolin will accompany you for security. I'm staying here to manage the quarantine and maintain the link with Dietrich. And Graves. He looked over at the quiet man in the corner. You're coming with me. Graves gave a slight, almost imperceptible frown, clearly displeased at being separated from the primary investigation team, but he simply nodded. The preparation for the descent was a tense, meticulous ritual. We climbed into our full RAC suits, the cumbersome white armor that was our only protection against an enemy we didn't understand. We checked our air supplies, our helmet comms, our high-intensity headlamps. Brolin carried a standard-issue M16 rifle, a weapon that we all knew, on some deep, instinctual level, would be utterly useless against the thing we were going to face. How do you shoot a song? How do you kill a hunger? Entering the mine was like stepping out of the world. The air temperature dropped by 20 degrees instantly. The sounds of the forest, of the generator, of life itself, were cut off as if by a closing door. The only sounds were the hiss of our own breathing and the crunch of our boots on the gravel-strewn floor. The beams of our headlamps cut sharp, white cones through a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical substance. The walls of the main tunnel were rough-hewn rock, supported by thick wooden beams black with age and dampness. The air was thick with the smell of coal dust and that same strange, sweet metallic tang, much stronger now. It coated the back of my throat. We moved deeper, following the narrow-gauge railway tracks that disappeared into the oppressive blackness ahead. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, listening silence. I had the unshakable feeling that we were walking down the throat of some immense, sleeping beast. After about 200 yards, we started to see the signs. The first were the scratches on the walls, long, deep gouges in the rock, running in parallel lines, not made by mining tools. They were fingernail marks, dozens of them, a testament to a desperate, clawing madness. Then we found a pickaxe lying on the ground. Its steel head was fine, but the thick, hickory handle was splintered and scarred, covered in what were unmistakably human tooth marks. They were trying to eat the tools, Brolin whispered, his voice a strained rasp over the comms. We finally reached the cavern where the rescue team had found the miners. It was a large open space where several tunnels converged. The floor was a litter of discarded equipment, helmets, lamps, a few of the ubiquitous metal lunch pails. And everywhere, on every surface, were small, pathetic, neatly arranged piles of rock. It was a shrine to an insane god. It was the nest of the hunger. Aris pointed her light down a smaller side tunnel. Finch, look. At the far end of the tunnel, I could see it. A faint greenish glow, pulsing with that same slow, steady rhythm I had seen from the outside. It was beckoning us. We proceeded down the narrow tunnel, forced to walk in single file. The glow grew stronger, brighter with every step, the pulsing light casting our long, distorted shadows on the walls around us. And as we got closer, I began to hear something. It wasn't through the comms. It was a vibration, a low hum that I felt in the bones of my skull. It was the same E-flat hum from the miner's audio logs, the singing the pilot had spoken of. We emerged into a small, natural cavern, and we saw it. The entire back wall of the cavern was a massive, exposed seam of anthracite coal, but it had been fractured, split open as if by a great force. And inside the fracture, nestled in the heart of the ancient black coal, was the organism. It was a breathtaking, horrifyingly beautiful sight. It was a vast, intricate network of bioluminescent green and gold filaments, a living lace that spread over the rock for 20 square yards. It pulsed in unison, a single, living entity, its light waxing and waning like a slow, deep breath. The air in the cavern hummed with its low, resonant song. It looked like a map of a distant galaxy, a constellation of living stars embedded in the rock. It was the heart of the hunger. And there, lying on a small ledge right beside the glowing mass, as if placed there deliberately, was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was a diary. Its cover was damp, but intact. With a sense of stepping onto sacred, forbidden ground, Eris moved forward. She carefully picked up the notebook. She opened it, its pages stiff with moisture. She shone her headlamp on the first page. It was a standard diary entry written in a neat, looping cursive. October 3rd. Another long shift. The foreman is pushing us hard. Says we're close to a rich new seam. She flipped through several pages. The entries were mundane, chronicling the daily life of a miner. Then the handwriting began to change. It grew more hurried, more erratic. October 10th. Can't sleep. There's a humming in the walls. The other boys hear it too. Sounds like singing. Eris flipped to the last page. The writing there was a barely legible scrawl, the pencil having dug deep into the paper. It was a frantic, desperate message. The singing stone. It's so beautiful. It's so hungry. It wants the bones of the earth. As Eris read the words aloud, a new sound joined the low hum in the cavern. A sharp, rhythmic clicking. Click, tack, click. It came from all around us, echoing off the rock walls, a dry, articulate sound that was getting louder. And I realized, with a surge of pure, ice-cold terror, that the sound wasn't coming from the glowing mold. It was coming from inside my own helmet. It was coming from my radio. The song was getting stronger. It had found us, and it was inviting us to the feast. The first click in my helmet's radio was a sound of pure, crystalline intrusion. It was not a sound of the earth. It was sharp, articulate, and utterly alien. It sliced through the low, resonant hum of the cavern, through the hiss of my own breathing, and seemed to insert itself directly into my brainstem. It was followed by another. Click, tack, click. A rhythm. A cadence. It was the sound of the signal I'd been analyzing, the ghost in Miller's radio. But it was no longer a distant, faint interference. It was a local broadcast. And we were the intended audience. Eris, Brolin, do you hear that? I asked, my voice tight, strained. Loud and clear, Sergeant Brolin's voice crackled back, and for the first time, I heard a tremor in his granite-like composure. What the hell is it? It's the song, Eris whispered, her voice a mixture of pure terror and rapt scientific fascination. She was staring at the pulsing, luminous wall of the organism. We're in the choir loft. It knows we're here. It's talking to us. The clicks became more insistent, faster. They layered over one another, creating a complex, chattering tapestry of sound that was both meaningless and filled with a terrible, pressing intent. And with the sound came a feeling. A physical pressure that started behind my eyes and began to spread, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the glowing wall. My teeth began to ache, a deep, resonant pain in the roots, as if they were vibrating in sympathy with the hum from the rock, and the metallic taste in my mouth, the taste of a wet penny, returned with a vengeance, flooding my tongue with the flavor of old iron and copper. "We have to go," I said, turning away from the beautiful, horrifying wall of light. "Now. We have the diary. We have the visual confirmation. Our mission here is done." "Negative, Doctor," Brolin said, his voice regaining a measure of its authority. "Dr. Thorne needs a primary sample from the source. Those are our orders." "Our orders didn't account for an active, hostile biological agent broadcasting on a resonant frequency," I shot back, my own panic making my words sharp. "Look at what happened to Miller. He was 100 yards away, on the surface. We're standing in the goddamn blast furnace." Iris, however, was already moving. She was pulling a cryogenic sample container from her pack, her movements swift and precise despite the pressure building in our skulls. "Alan's right, Sergeant. But I'm not leaving without a viable, active sample. If we can isolate the frequency of this living specimen, we might be able to create a counter-frequency. A jammer. It's our only chance of treating Miller. Or ourselves." Her logic was sound, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. The clicking in my helmet was becoming a hypnotic, structured pattern. I found my eyes drawn back to the pulsing wall. The light was so beautiful. It shifted from green to gold, then to a deep, mesmerizing violet. It felt welcoming. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a feeling of profound, ancient peace. A feeling of coming home. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to take off my helmet, to breathe in the sweet, metallic air, to reach out and touch the glowing, living stone. I saw my own gloved hand begin to lift, a slow, involuntary movement. I watched it as if it belonged to someone else. It was reaching for the helmet's release clasps. With a surge of horrified adrenaline, I forced it back down, balling it into a fist so tight my knuckles ached. The organism wasn't just broadcasting. It was persuading. It was seducing. "Aris! Hurry!" I yelled, my voice cracking. She worked with a desperate grace, using a long robotic arm to scrape a small section of the glowing mycelial network into the cryotube. The moment the sample was sealed, the hum in the cavern rose in pitch, becoming a high, keening wail of protest. The light from the wall flared, pulsing with a rapid, angry rhythm. "It felt that," Aris breathed. "It's a single consciousness." "Let's go!" Brolin barked, finally convinced. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the tunnel. Aris was right behind us, clutching the cryotube to her chest like a holy relic. We plunged back into the narrow tunnel, our headlamps cutting frantic, bouncing circles in the oppressive dark. The wailing sound from the cavern pursued us, echoing off the rock walls. The clicking in our radios was a frantic, chaotic storm of sound now, a psychic assault that made it almost impossible to think. I focused on the simple mechanics of movement. Left foot, right foot. Breathe. Don't look at the walls. Don't think about the satisfying, gritty texture of the rock. We had made it halfway back down the tunnel when Brolin suddenly stopped. He was standing stock still, his head cocked as if listening to a voice only he could hear. "Sergeant?" I said, my voice tight. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He slowly turned his head and looked at the rock wall beside him. He lifted his hand, the one not holding his rifle, and gently, almost lovingly, caressed the rough, damp surface of the coal seam. I saw his thumb rub back and forth over a small crystalline inclusion in the rock, his touch a gesture of profound tenderness. "It's so quiet in here," he whispered, his voice a strange, dreamy murmur. "The song is so clear." "Brolin, snap out of it!" Aris shouted, her voice sharp. "That's the organism talking, not you!" But he was already lost. His eyes, visible through his helmet's faceplate, were unfocused, milky. He was looking at the rock with an expression of intense, rapturous longing. The same look a starving man might give a banquet. "We have to leave him," I said, the words tasting like poison. "He's gone. If we stay, it will get us too." "No," Aris said, her voice fierce. "We don't leave anyone behind." She moved to grab his arm, but as she did, Brolin's head snapped towards her. The dreamy expression was gone, replaced by a flash of raw, animal hostility. He let out a low growl, a sound that was not entirely human, and shoved her back. He was strong, far stronger than he should have been. The shove sent Aris stumbling back into me. And then he turned his back on us, facing the direction of the main cavern. He took one step, then another, walking back towards the light, back towards the song. He was a man being reeled in by an invisible line. He was going home, and we were left alone in the dark, with the terrible knowledge that the infection wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a certainty. It was a race. And we had just lost one of our runners. Watching Sergeant Brolin, our protector, our anchor of military discipline, turn and walk calmly back into the embrace of the pulsing light was one of the most profoundly terrifying moments of my life. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He walked with the placid, determined gait of a man who has finally understood his purpose. We had lost him. Not to a monster with claws and teeth, but to a whisper, to a song that had promised him a peace we couldn't offer. "We can't help him," I said to Aris, my voice a ragged whisper that was barely audible over the frantic clicking in my helmet and the pounding of my own heart. "If we go after him, we'll end up just like him. We have to get to the surface. We have to warn Kincaid." Aris stood frozen for a moment, her light still trained on the empty tunnel where Brolin had disappeared. I could see the conflict in her face, the war between her duty as a doctor and the cold, hard logic of survival. Finally, she nodded, a single sharp jerk of her head. "You're right," she said, her voice grim. "Let's move." We turned and began a stumbling, frantic retreat through the winding corridors of the mine. The journey that had been filled with a sense of creeping dread on the way in was now a desperate, panicked flight. Every shadow seemed to leap out at us. Every drip of water from the ceiling sounded like a footstep behind us. The low hum of the mountain seemed to be vibrating in the very air we were breathing through our suits. A constant, oppressive presence. But the real battle was no longer in the tunnels around us. It was inside our own skulls. The clicking sound in our radios was a relentless, percussive assault. But it was starting to change. It was no longer just a random, chaotic noise. Patterns were emerging, melodies. A complex atonal symphony was being constructed, note by note, inside my head. It was the most intricate and intelligent sound I had ever heard. A beautiful, terrifying mathematics of pure tone. And with the song came the thoughts. They weren't my thoughts. They slipped into my mind, sly and uninvited, masquerading as my own internal monologue. "It's not so bad," a voice that sounded like my own whispered in my head. "The hunger isn't a curse. It's a clarification, a simplification." I stumbled, catching myself against the rough rock wall. The texture of the stone, even through the thick material of my glove, sent a jolt of something that felt disturbingly like pleasure through my arm. It felt solid, real, more real than the flimsy, organic shell of my own body. "Flesh is temporary," the voice continued, smooth and reasonable. "Flesh rots, it weakens, it dies, but the earth is eternal. To consume it is to become part of that eternity, to join with something permanent. Isn't that what all life seeks? Permanence? No," I grunted aloud, shaking my head violently, trying to dislodge the insidious logic. It's a trick, a psychic illusion caused by the resonant frequency. I was trying to fight a philosophical argument with scientific jargon, a flimsy shield against a devastatingly seductive idea. "What did you say, Alan?" Eris asked, her voice strained. She was a few feet ahead of me, her own pace unsteady. "The thoughts?" I gasped. It's talking. It's trying to convince me." "I know," she said, her breathing heavy. "It's showing me things. The crystalline lattice of a quartz vein, the slow, patient pressure that forms a diamond. It's showing me the beauty of its world. It's magnificent." The organism was a masterful psychological warrior. It didn't use fear. It used beauty. It didn't threaten us with death. It offered us a form of immortality. It was appealing to the most basic, elemental parts of our consciousness, the scientist's desire for knowledge, the philosopher's search for meaning, the mortal's fear of oblivion. And it was terrifyingly effective. I found myself looking at the walls of the mine not as a threat, but with a new kind of eye. I saw the layers of sediment, the story of millions of years of geological time written in the rock. I saw the veins of coal, not as a fuel source, but as the compressed, purified essence of ancient forests. The voice in my head was telling me that to eat the rock was to consume that history, to take that ancient strength into myself. The hunger was no longer just a physical craving. It was an intellectual one, a spiritual one. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. I focused on a different memory. The memory of the dead miner on the autopsy table. The gaunt face. The hollow eyes. The stomach full of useless, life-denying stone. That was the reality of the hunger. Not a beautiful communion with the earth, but a slow, agonizing starvation of the flesh. A body being cannibalized from the inside out to serve a purpose that was not its own. "It's a parasite, Eris!" I shouted, my own voice a lifeline in the sea of its song. "It's a parasite that starves its host to feed itself. Remember the man on the table?" My words seemed to cut through her own trance. She shook her head, as if waking from a dream. "Right," she breathed. "The host. The machinery." We pushed on, our retreat now a conscious, deliberate act of rebellion against our own minds. Every step away from the heart of the song was a victory. But the further we went, the more desperate the song became. The clicking grew frantic. The beautiful melodies were replaced by a jarring, discordant noise, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. It was like a jilted lover, its seduction having failed, now screaming insults at us. We reached the main cavern, the one with the pathetic little shrines of rock. And we saw a new addition. The pickaxe with the chewed handle was no longer on the floor. It had been propped up against the wall, and arranged around its base was a new, neat circle of stones. Brolin's handiwork. He had made his own offering before continuing his final pilgrimage. We were almost to the main entrance tunnel when my foot snagged on something. I fell hard, my helmeted head cracking against the rocky ground. The world exploded in a flash of white light. My headlamp flickered and died. I was plunged into absolute disorienting blackness. "Alan!" I heard Eris cry out. "I'm okay," I grunted, rolling over. "My light's out." As I lay there in the dark, with only the distant bouncing beam of Eris's lamp for illumination, a new sensation washed over me. The song, the clicking, the angry noise in my radio. It suddenly stopped. For a blissful second, there was silence in my head. A profound, peaceful quiet. And in that quiet, I felt the hunger with a purity that was uncluttered by the psychic noise. It was a deep, physical, gnawing ache in the pit of my stomach. A hollow, desperate craving that was more powerful than any physical hunger I'd ever known. And I knew what would satisfy it. I could taste it on my tongue. The cool, gritty, mineral taste of shale. I pushed myself up and my hand brushed against a loose piece of rock on the floor. It was about the size of my fist. And without thinking, without choosing, I picked it up. It felt right in my hand. Cool. Solid. Perfect. I brought it up towards my faceplate. My movements slow, deliberate, robotic. I knew on some distant, rational level that I was trying to eat it, that the madness had finally taken me. But that rational part of my brain was a tiny, screaming voice in a vast, silent cathedral of need. The hunger was no longer a voice in my head. It was in my blood. It was in my bones. It was me. The feeling of the rock in my hand was the most profound sensation I have ever experienced. It was not just a physical object. It was a promise. It was the answer to a question my body had just learned to ask. The gnawing emptiness in my gut, an abyss of unnatural craving, was calling out for this one specific thing. The cool, solid weight of it, the rough, gritty texture of it, was a perfect symphony of sensory input that my newly rewired brain interpreted as the ultimate sustenance. My entire being, every cell, every nerve ending was screaming at me to consume it. I saw my own arm, a ghostly white limb in the dim light from Eris's headlamp, bring the piece of shale up to my faceplate. The rational part of my mind, the Doctor Alan Finch who had existed before this moment, was a helpless, horrified passenger. He was screaming, shouting, trying to pull the levers of a body that no longer responded to his commands. The hunger was at the controls now. I watched as my gloved fingers scraped against the hard polycarbonate of my visor, a frantic, futile attempt to get the rock to my mouth. A low, frustrated sound, half whimper, half growl, escaped my throat. "Alan! No!" Eris's voice cut through the fog. She was suddenly there, grabbing my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She wrestled the rock from my hand. It clattered to the floor of the mine. The moment it left my grasp, a wave of the most intense, soul-crushing despair I have ever known washed over me. It was a grief so profound it felt like a physical bereavement. A part of me had just been stolen. "Fight it, Alan!" she yelled, her faceplate inches from mine. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but also fiercely, furiously determined. "It's the suit! Your headlamp going out. The power surge must have caused a momentary failure in your suit's internal comms filter. The signal got through to you, raw and unfiltered. It's what happened to Miller." She was right. The silence I had experienced hadn't been peace. It had been the sound of the gates being thrown wide open. The song had poured into my brain, unimpeded. With a monumental effort of will, I tried to push back against the tide. I focused on Eris's face, on the anchor of her humanity. I dredged up the image of the dead miner, his body a wasted ruin. It's a lie, I told myself. The words, a desperate mantra. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. Slowly, agonizingly, the fog began to recede. The all-consuming need for the rock was replaced by the cold, clammy sweat of my own terror. The control of my limbs seeped back into me. I was shaking violently, my body convulsing with the aftershocks of the psychic intrusion. I had it, I stammered, my voice trembling. "Aris, I had it." "I know," she said, her own voice shaky with relief. "But you fought it. You came back." She helped me to my feet. My legs were weak, unsteady. My head was throbbing a dull, brutal ache. But I was me again. For now. "My suit," I said, my hand going to my side. "When I fell, I found it. A small, 3-inch tear in the reinforced fabric of my RAC suit just above my hip. A jagged rip from where I'd landed on a sharp piece of rock. It wasn't large, but it was a fatal breach. The filtered, sterile environment of my suit was compromised. I was breathing the air of the mine. I was breathing in the very essence of the organism. Not just its song, but its physical presence. It was only a matter of time before the hunger came back, stronger this time, and took me for good. Aris saw it too. I saw her eyes fix on the tear, and I saw the terrible, unspoken understanding that passed between us. I was a dead man walking. I was a ticking clock. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice dropping the false cheer of encouragement and adopting a tone of grim, urgent resolve. She got on her radio. "Kincaid, do you read me? This is Thorne. Come in, Major." The radio crackled. "I read you, Thorne," Kincaid's voice came back, thin and stretched with static and panic. "What's your status?" "We lost Brolin's signal. And Miller. God, Miller's gone. He broke out of the shelter. He overpowered the guard. He's heading for the mine entrance. He's talking about going home." A fresh wave of ice-cold dread washed over us. We were trapped. The source of the infection, the angry, wailing consciousness of the mother organism, was behind us. And now, one of its puppets, a man driven by the pure, undiluted madness of the hunger, was coming down the tunnel towards us. We were caught in a pincer movement with a madman on one side and a malevolent god on the other. "Seal the entrance, Kincaid," Eris shouted into a radio. "Use the emergency blast doors. Now!" "Negative!" Kincaid's voice was frantic. "The manual override is inside the mine, 100 feet from the entrance. I can't get to it without opening the outer doors. And Miller is right there. He's clawing at them." We were on our own. I looked at Eris, at the exhaustion and terror in her eyes, and I saw it mirrored in her reflection on my own faceplate. This was the point of no return. We had entered the belly of the beast, and it was now closing its jaws. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice betraying the hopelessness I felt. Eris looked from me to the dark tunnel ahead where Miller was coming, then back to the deeper darkness behind us where Brolin had gone. Her mind was working, her expression a mixture of intense calculation and profound sorrow. She was weighing variables, probabilities, costs, and the cost, I could see, was going to be astronomical. "We can't both get out," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of scientific fact. "But we can't let this thing win. We can't let it get to the surface." She looked down at the cryo tube she was still clutching, the one containing the active sample. Then she looked at me, and her eyes held a new, terrifying clarity. "The organism is geological, Alan. It needs this specific environment, this specific mineral-rich coal seam. That's its strength, but it's also its weakness." She was formulating a plan, a desperate, final, terrible plan. I could see it being born in her eyes. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow of my bones, that it was a plan that I was meant to survive. And she was not. She was about to make a choice, and the mountain was about to demand its price. The silence in the tunnel was thick and heavy, broken only by our ragged breathing and the distant, maddening sound of Specialist Miller clawing at the outer doors. Aris stood before me, the beam of her headlamp illuminating the swirling dust, making it look like a galaxy of tiny, frantic stars. In that moment, she no longer looked like just a scientist. She looked like a soldier, a general surveying a battlefield and calculating the final, brutal cost of victory. "The old mining companies," she began, her voice a low, steady lecture, a deliberate retreat into the safety of facts and logic. "In the 1940s and 50s, they used extensive blasting charges to open up new seams, but they were unstable, prone to sympathetic detonation. Most of the unused charges were removed, but according to the schematics Kincaid has, some of the deeper, more unstable placements were never recovered. They were simply sealed off. They're still down there, Alan. Dozens of crates of military-grade dynamite sweating nitroglycerin for 40 years. I stared at her, the implication of her words dawning on me like a black sun. Aris, no. The primary support pillars for this entire section of the mine are located less than 50 yards from the main cavern, she continued, ignoring me, her voice gaining speed and intensity as the equation solved itself in her mind. The schematics show a major fault line running directly beneath them. If those charges were detonated, it wouldn't just be a cave-in, it would be a localized seismic event. The entire mountainside would collapse. Millions of tons of rock burying this place, this organism, under 1,000 feet of granite and limestone. You can't, I said, my voice a pathetic croak. You'll never make it back out in time. I'm not trying to make it back out, she said, and the simple, devastating finality of her words struck me dumb. She looked at the rip in my suit. You're compromised, Ellen. The hunger is already in your blood. Your only chance is to get to the surface, get into a sterile environment, and start a course of chelation therapy. We have to hope we can purge the mineral compounds from your system before the craving becomes permanent. You're the control group now. You're the only one who can carry the warning. She gently took the heavy satchel of sample containers and research notes from my shoulder. She added her own cryotube, the one with the glowing, living heart of the organism inside. You will take this, she said, pressing the satchel into my hands. You will get to the surface. You will tell Kincaid to pull everyone back to a 5-mile radius. And then you will get on a helicopter, and you will not look back. You will take this data to Fort Detrick. You will make them understand. You will make them listen. This wasn't a choice she was offering me. It was an order. It was the last will and testament of Dr. Eris Thorne. I won't leave you, I said, my voice thick with a useless, impotent grief. You will, she said, and her voice was steel. This is the only variable in the equation that works. My life, for the containment of a species-level threat. It's a logical, sound, and necessary trade. You are a man of science, Alan. You understand that. Tears were streaming down my face, fogging the inside of my visor. I was watching the greatest mind I'd ever known, the bravest person I'd ever met, calmly and rationally, planning her own execution for the good of a world that would never even know her name. She placed her gloved hand on the side of my helmet, a gesture of profound and final intimacy. It's okay, Alan, she said, her voice softening. In a way, this is what we were trained for, to stand between humanity and the things that want to devour it. I just never thought the thing would be a rock that sings. She gave a small, sad, beautiful smile. Now go. That's an order from your superior officer. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a stupid, jerking motion. She turned to face the deep, humming darkness from which we had just fled. She took a deep breath, and I could hear it over the comms, the sound of a woman steeling herself for the final, lonely walk. I'm going back for Brolin's rifle, she said. I may need it. Then I'm going to find those charges. Aris, I started, but I didn't know what to say. Thank you. I'm sorry. I love you. All the words were too small, too hollow. Just get the data out, Alan, she said, her voice already distant. Make it matter. And then she began to walk, back into the darkness, back towards the song. I was left alone, clutching the satchel of her life's work, a helpless, weeping witness. I turned and began my own retreat, a stumbling, broken thing, each step away from her feeling like a physical betrayal. My radio was still open. I could hear her. I could hear her steady, controlled breathing. I could hear the crunch of her boots. It was my only connection to her, a fragile electronic thread. I heard her reach the main cavern. I heard her find Brolin's rifle. I heard her begin the search for the explosives, her path guided by a 40-year-old map and an iron will. And all the while I could hear the song in the background, the humming and the clicking, growing more intense, more seductive. The mountain knew what she was planning, and it was singing to her, trying to turn her, trying to make her one of its own. I heard her start to falter. Her breathing became ragged. I heard her stumble. I heard her whisper, "Oh God, it's so beautiful, Alan. The patterns, the light, it's showing me the bones of the earth." She was succumbing. The hunger was winning. The tendrils of the song were wrapping around her mind, her soul. I wanted to scream, to tell her to stop, to run. But I was miles away, a ghost on the radio. And then, through the psychic noise, I heard her voice clear and sharp, one last time. A final act of defiance, a scientist's observation. "It's not just eating, Alan," she gasped, her voice a revelation. "It's building. It's turning the mountain into a resonator, an antenna. It's trying to call something else." The line went dead for a second, then crackled back to life. It was just her breathing now, shallow and fast. Then, a single, final, garbled phrase, a poetic epitaph for a world she was about to save. "The hunger. It's a craving for the earth's bones." I heard a click, not the clicking of the song, a small, sharp, mechanical click, the sound of a detonator being armed. Then came the roar. The roar was not a sound, it was a physical event. It was a wave of pure kinetic force that traveled through the rock, through the air, through the very bones of my body. The ground beneath me bucked and heaved like a living thing. I was thrown from my feet, slammed against the tunnel wall with a violence that knocked the breath from my lungs and sent a fresh spiderweb of cracks across my damaged faceplate. The world became a maelstrom of noise, a symphony of destruction composed of the shriek of tortured rock and the deep, gut-wrenching groan of a mountain tearing itself apart. The tunnel behind me, the path I had taken from Aris, the one that led back to the heart of the song, simply ceased to exist. It collapsed in on itself. A tidal wave of stone and dust and darkness that rushed forward, swallowing the light from my headlamp. The concussion wave hit me a second later, a hot, violent wind that screamed past me, extinguishing my light and plunging me into absolute, profound blackness. My radio, which had been filled with the sound of Aris's last moments, went silent, replaced by a deafening, piercing tone of pure static. The thread had been cut. I lay there for an eternity, pinned to the floor by the sheer, overwhelming sensory assault. My ears rang. My vision was a swirling vortex of blackness and flashing phosphins. The very air was thick with a choking, gritty dust that was already beginning to clog the filters of my suit. I was buried alive. This was it. The end. But then, slowly, agonizingly, the world began to settle. The violent shaking subsided, replaced by a deep, continuous rumble and the sporadic crack and groan of settling rock. The roar faded, and in its place, silence. A silence unlike any I had ever known. The song was gone. The incessant, maddening clicking in my head had stopped. The low, resonant hum of the mountain was extinguished. The psychic pressure that had been squeezing my brain for hours was released. The sudden quiet was so absolute, so profound, that it was in itself a form of noise. It was the sound of a closing door. Aris had done it. She had silenced the song. She had buried the hunger. I pushed myself up, my body a symphony of its own, a chorus of aches and bruises. I fumbled at my helmet, my shaking hands finding the manual switch for my headlamp. I flicked it. Nothing. The bulb was smashed. I was blind. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat. I was alone, in the dark, deep beneath a collapsing mountain, with a torn suit and a brain that had been scraped raw by an alien consciousness. Survival was a statistical improbability. But then I remembered her last command. Get the data out. Make it matter. My survival was no longer about me. It was about her. It was about honoring her sacrifice. My life was the vessel for her legacy. That thought gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I began to crawl, feeling my way through the darkness. My goal was the emergency blast door override, 100 feet inside the main entrance. It was my only hope. I crawled over shifting piles of rock and debris, my hands, even through the thick gloves, being scraped raw. The air was getting thinner, the dust thicker. My suit's filters were failing. Each breath was a desperate, burning gasp. I don't know how long I crawled. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning in the dark. But then my hand touched something smooth, cold, and vertical. Metal. The wall of the main entrance tunnel. I was close. I pulled myself to my feet, using the wall for support, and began to shuffle forward, one hand trailing against the cool steel. And then I saw it. A light. A single, wavering, pale beam cutting through the thick, swirling dust ahead. For a delirious moment, I thought it was a rescue team. I thought Kincaid had found a way in. I opened my mouth to shout, but the word died in my throat. Because the figure holding the light was not a rescuer. It was a man in the tattered, filthy uniform of a coal miner. His face was gaunt, skeletal, his eyes wide and burning with a cold blue fire in the gloom. His skin was caked with a mixture of coal dust and dried blood. It was Specialist Miller. He stood there, in the middle of the tunnel, blocking my path. He was holding a heavy, military-issue flashlight, its beam unsteady in his trembling hand. And in his other hand, he was holding a rock. A jagged, heavy piece of iron ore. He was stroking it, caressing it, the way a man might stroke a pet. The hunger in his eyes was absolute. It was a pure, undiluted, and terrifying thing to behold. He had been on the surface when the song was silenced, but it had already done its work. It had planted a seed in his mind, and that seed had bloomed into a forest of madness. He saw me. His head tilted, and a low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest. He was no longer Miller. He was just a vessel, a piece of machinery animated by a dead god's last command. He began to walk towards me, his steps slow, deliberate, shuffling. He lifted the rock, his intentions unmistakable. The final echo of the mountain's hunger, the last dying ghost of the song, was coming to claim me. And I was alone, in the dark, with nothing but a satchel full of research and the memory of a woman who had died to give me this one last, impossible chance. The mountain had fallen silent, but the war for my survival was not over yet. It had just become terrifyingly personal. The confrontation with what was left of Specialist Miller was not a fight. It was a collision of two opposing desperations. In the swirling, dust-choked darkness of the collapsed tunnel, he was a totem of the hunger that had consumed him, a walking corpse animated by a single, all-powerful need. And I was a vessel of a different kind, a container for Aris's last hope, fueled by a grief so profound it had burned away my fear. He shuffled towards me, the rock held high like a sacred talisman. The beam of his flashlight danced wildly, illuminating his face in stark, terrifying flashes. His eyes were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a craving, pure and simple. There was no recognition in them, no memory of the nervous young soldier who had complained about a headache that now seemed a lifetime ago. "Miller," I said, my voice a raw rasp. I didn't expect a response. I was just talking to myself, to the ghost of the man who was about to try and kill me. "It's over. The song is gone." He answered with a guttural roar and lunged. For a man who was essentially starving to death, his strength was inhuman. It was the last, furious energy of the organism, a final twitch from its severed nerve endings. He swung the rock. I threw myself to the side. The satchel of Eris's data clutched to my chest like a shield. The rock smashed against the steel wall of the tunnel, the impact echoing like a gunshot, sending a shower of sparks into the dusty air. I scrambled back, trying to put distance between us. He was a creature of pure instinct now, and my only advantage was the flickering ember of reason that Eris had saved in me. I couldn't outfight him. I had to outthink him. I looked around frantically, my eyes trying to pierce the gloom. The tunnel was a wreck of fallen beams and shattered rock. My gaze fell on a thick, heavy power cable snaking down from the ceiling, its rubber insulation torn in several places, revealing the bright copper wires within. It was one of the main power lines for the mine's ventilation system. The generator on the surface was gone, destroyed in the collapse. But there were emergency battery backups somewhere, and a deep, residual charge could linger for hours. It was a long shot, a desperate, insane gamble. Miller was coming again, his breathing a harsh, wet rattle. He was between me and the cable. I did the only thing I could think of. I feinted to the left, and as he followed, I dove to the right, rolling over a pile of debris. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through my bruised body, but it worked. I was past him. I scrambled to the cable, my torn suit offering little protection. I grabbed it with both hands. It was thick, heavy, and slick with moisture. I began to pull, heaving with a strength born of pure adrenaline. The cable was secured to the ceiling with heavy steel clamps. I yanked and twisted, feeling the clamps begin to groan and bend under the strain. Miller turned, his movement slow, confused, like a predator that has lost track of its prey. He saw me. He let out another roar of fury and charged. He was 10 feet away when the first clamp gave way. The heavy cable sagged, swinging down like a dead serpent. He was 5 feet away when the second one snapped. The cable fell, landing in a deep pool of stagnant water that had collected on the tunnel floor. The moment the exposed copper wires hit the water, the world turned white. A brilliant blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the water, a miniature lightning storm in the confines of the tunnel. The air crackled with the smell of ozone. Miller was standing right in the middle of it. His body went rigid, his back arching violently. The flashlight flew from his hand, its beam spinning wildly before extinguishing. He didn't even have time to scream. The massive electrical charge coursed through him, and for a single horrifying second, his entire body was silhouetted by the unholy light, a dark, human-shaped hole in a field of pure energy. Then he collapsed, falling face first into the electrified water with a final, ignominious splash. The arcing stopped. The only light was the faint, hellish blue glow of the shorting cable as it fizzled in the water. The only sound was the hiss and crackle of electricity. Then, silence. I lay there, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had killed him. I had killed what was left of him. It wasn't a victory. It was a mercy killing. A final, ugly, necessary act in a tragedy of errors. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. The way was clear. I stumbled forward past the silent, floating form of Specialist Miller, my eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of gray light that I could now see at the far end of the tunnel. It was the blast door, partially blocked by rubble, but with a gap big enough for a man to squeeze through. It was daylight. It was survival. I emerged from the mine into a world of chaos. The clearing was a disaster zone. The command tent was shredded. The military vehicles were overturned, some of them on fire. A massive cloud of gray dust hung over the entire valley, a funeral shroud for the mountain that had died. Kincaid and his men were there, their faces black with soot, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Kincaid saw me. He ran over, his face a mask of frantic relief. "Finch? My God, we thought you were dead. What happened? Where's Thorne?" I couldn't speak. I just held out the satchel. I pushed it into his hands. "Make it matter," I rasped, my voice a broken thing. And then the last of my strength gave out, and I collapsed into his arms, the world dissolving into a welcome, merciful blackness. My rescue was the beginning of my damnation. I was airlifted to Walter Reed, but I wasn't a patient. I was a specimen. I was placed in a sealed biocontainment ward, a lab rat in a sterile cage. For weeks, I was subjected to an endless battery of tests, scans, and a brutal, agonizing course of intravenous chelation therapy that felt like liquid fire being pumped into my veins. They were trying to purge the mountain from my blood. The men in gray suits were my only visitors, not graves. I never saw them again. These were new men, higher up the food chain. They were not interested in what had happened. They were interested in what I knew. I told them everything. I told them about the song, the light, the hunger. I told them about Eris. I showed them her notes, explained her theories, her final, desperate sacrifice. They listened patiently, their faces impassive. When I was finished, one of them, a silver-haired man with cold, intelligent eyes, slid a thick file across the table to me. It was the official report. Operation Bedrock. The incident at Blackwood Shaft No. 4, it stated, was a tragic mining accident. An unexpected pocket of methane gas had been ignited by faulty equipment, causing a catastrophic collapse. The miners, along with a USAMRIID consultation team, Doctors Finch and Thorne, and Sergeant Brolin, were tragically lost. The report was a masterpiece of fiction, a seamless, believable lie. Dr. Thorne and Sergeant Brolin will be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, posthumously, the man said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Their families will be told they died heroes, trying to rescue the trapped miners. "And me?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Dr. Alan Finch died a hero as well," the man said. "The world thinks you are dead. It is better that way. It is cleaner." They were erasing me. They were burying Eris's truth under a mountain of their own, a mountain of paper and lies. "Her research," I said, my hand trembling as I pointed to the satchel. "The data. You have to. The data will be classified at the highest level," the man interrupted gently. "It will be studied. Your colleague's sacrifice will not be in vain, I assure you. But it will never see the light of day. The world is not ready for this, Doctor. The knowledge that there is a form of life on this planet that perceives us as nothing more than biological mining equipment. That is a truth that our civilization could not bear." He was right. I knew he was right. But it didn't make the lie any less bitter. They let the chelation therapy run its course. It worked. Or at least they told me it did. The physical craving for the minerals faded, replaced by the phantom limb of a hunger I would carry with me for the rest of my life. When I was deemed clean, they gave me a new name, a new history, a new life. A quiet, academic existence at a small, out-of-the-way university, where I could be monitored. I became a ghost, haunting the fringes of a world I was no longer truly a part of. For 38 years, I kept their secret. I honored Eris's sacrifice with my silence, believing it was what she would have wanted. I told myself that her equation was correct, that her life was a fair price for keeping Pandora's box closed. I grew old. I watched the world change. I watched humanity build its towers of concrete and glass, its cities of steel and stone, and I would feel a faint echo of that old, wrong hunger, a whisper that told me what a magnificent feast we were building. But now, they're going back, with their sonic drills and their deep earth fracturing. They're going to knock on that closed door. They're going to wake the things that sleep in the bones of the earth. The organism I saw may be dead, buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. But Eris's last, garbled message haunts me. It's trying to call something else. What if the song wasn't a lure for its prey? What if it was a broadcast? A signal sent out into the void, waiting for a response? What if the hunger we encountered was just an outpost? A single, lonely spore that landed on this planet millennia ago and has been patiently, quietly calling for its family to come home. That is the fear that has driven me to make this recording. That is the truth that has finally outweighed my fear of the men in suits. Eris didn't just silence a song. She interrupted a call. And now, a new generation of arrogant, curious men are about to unwittingly press the redial button. My part is done. The tape is running out. This is all that is left of Dr. Alan Finch and of the memory of Dr. Eris Thorne. It is a warning, written in the language of ghosts. They will tell you that the earth is dead, that it is nothing but rock and dirt. Do not believe them. The earth is alive. It is ancient, and it is hungry. And we have built our world on top of its plate. I reach out a hand that is no longer steady. My fingers find the stop button. The reels will stop turning. The story will end. But I know, as I have known every single day for the past 38 years, that the silence that follows will not be empty. It will be a listening silence. The silence of something that has been waiting for a very, very long time to hear its favorite song again. So that's the story of Dr. Alan Finch and the hunger under the hills of West Virginia. It's a story about how a routine investigation into a strange illness uncovered a form of life that defies our most basic understanding of biology. A life that sees our world not as a home, but as a meal. Officially, Operation Bedrock ended in tragedy, a simple mining accident. But we know the truth now. The real tragedy wasn't the collapse of the mine, but the silencing of a brilliant woman who understood that some hungers should never be fed. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, or look at the ground beneath your feet a little differently, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, listen to the silence. And be careful what songs you sing in the dark. You never know who or what might be listening.